At 6:47 p.m. on June 26, 1943, Lieutenant Robert S. Johnson felt his Republic P-47 Thunderbolt shudder as cannon shells tore through the fuselage over northern France. The first impact shattered his canopy. Plexiglass exploded inward, fragments slashing across the cockpit as hydraulic fluid sprayed over his face and instrument panel. A second burst followed immediately, metal ripping, rivets popping free, the aircraft vibrating like it was coming apart in midair. Johnson was 23 years old. He had flown 13 combat missions. He had one confirmed aerial victory. 16 Focke-Wulf FW-190s swarmed around him. Moments earlier, they had already destroyed 4 other Thunderbolts from the 56th Fighter Group. 3 American pilots were now dead in the English Channel. Johnson's squadron had launched from RAF Manston at 1,700 hours, tasked with escorting B-17 Flying Fortresses returning from a strike on Villacoublay airfield near Paris. The briefing had promised light opposition. The briefing was wrong. Near Forges-les-Eaux, the German fighters of JG-26 dropped out of the clouds from 27,000 feet, attacking with speed and coordination. Johnson was flying tail-end Charlie in the 61st Fighter Squadron, the most dangerous position in the formation. German pilots had a name for it: coffin corner. The first burst hit before Johnson could transmit a warning. 21 20mm cannon shells ripped through the Thunderbolt. The hydraulic system ruptured instantly. Oil sprayed across the windscreen, turning the world opaque. A machine gun round grazed the tip of his nose. Shrapnel from another shell buried itself in his right leg. A third punched through the armor plate behind his head and jammed the canopy frame. Fire erupted in the cockpit. The P-47 rolled violently and dropped into a flat spin. Johnson kicked full left rudder and hauled back on the control stick. The nose came up. The spin stopped. The fire went out, but he couldn't see. Hydraulic fluid had coated his goggles white. He tore them off. Oil covered his face. He tasted metal and fuel. He reached for the canopy release. Nothing happened. He braced his boots against the instrument panel and pulled with both hands. The frame was bent. The canopy wouldn't move. Johnson was trapped inside a crippled fighter 30 miles from the English coast, surrounded by enemy aircraft. The 56th Fighter Group had lost 47 pilots in its first 3 months over Europe. Most died in their first 10 missions. Johnson had beaten those odds by following one rule drilled into every Thunderbolt pilot: stay with your wingman. Never fly alone. But his wingman was gone. The formation was shattered. Every P-47 was fighting for survival, or already falling toward the earth. Johnson shoved the throttle forward. The Pratt & Whitney R-2800 coughed, but kept running. Maximum continuous power, 2,300 horsepower, dragged the wounded aircraft forward. Despite the damage, the Thunderbolt accelerated to 280 miles per hour. Republic Aviation had built the P-47 around one principle: bring the pilot home. It weighed nearly 8 tons fully loaded. Pilots called it the Jug, the flying bathtub, the anvil with wings. But they trusted it. Johnson had seen Thunderbolts return with entire cylinders shot away, with 3-foot holes torn through their wings. He had never seen damage like this. Cannon shells had ripped through both wings. The tail looked like it had been attacked with an axe. Half the instrument panel was gone. The oxygen system was dead. At altitude, he had 10 minutes before hypoxia would shut down his brain. Johnson shoved the nose down to 15,000 feet, where he could breathe. The English Channel lay ahead. Then he saw movement in his mirror. A single FW-190, blue and yellow markings, closing fast from his 6 o'clock. The German pilot was experienced, an ace. He slid smoothly into firing position 50 yards behind the crippled Thunderbolt. Johnson hunched down behind the armor plate and waited for the burst that would end it. The German pilot opened fire at 45 yards. Machine gun rounds hammered into the Thunderbolt's fuselage in long, steady bursts. Johnson felt the impacts through the seat and rudder pedals, sharp, metallic punches traveling through the airframe. The armor plate behind his head rang like a struck bell as bullets flattened against it. The 20mm cannons were silent. The German had already expended them attacking the bombers earlier in the engagement. What remained were 2 7.92mm machine guns, each firing 600 rounds per minute, enough to kill a pilot in seconds, if the bullets found flesh instead of steel. Johnson kicked the rudder pedals left, then right. The P-47 yawed clumsily, not evasion so much as refusal, making himself harder to hit by inches rather than yards. Oil streaked backward across the canopy. The controls felt heavy, imprecise, like steering a truck on ice. He pulled the throttle back. 190 miles per hour, just above stall speed. The FW-190 overshot. The German had misjudged the closing speed. The moment passed in less than a second. Johnson squeezed the trigger. 6 .50 caliber machine guns answered, tracers arcing toward the German fighter. Every round missed. Oil on the windscreen blurred the gun sight, and Johnson could barely see the enemy aircraft. Still, he fired, not to kill, but to signal that he was still fighting. The FW-190 banked left and climbed, setting up for another pass. Johnson shoved the throttle forward again. The R-2800 radial engine responded immediately. 18 air-cooled cylinders in 2 rows. No coolant system to rupture. No radiator to destroy with a single hit. German fighters with liquid-cooled engines often died from one well-placed round. The Thunderbolt did not. Johnson checked his fuel gauge. It read half full, but he didn't trust it. Cannon shells had damaged the fuel system. He might have 30 minutes of flight time left, or less. The English coast was still 12 miles away. Altitude was bleeding off. 14,000 feet. The aircraft handled like it was dragging an anchor. The German came again, this time from the right rear quarter, slightly low, matching Johnson's speed. The FW-190 was faster, nearly 390 miles per hour in level flight. But the German wasn't trying to disengage. He was flying a textbook attack, closing to point-blank range to make every bullet count. The second burst lasted 8 seconds. Machine gun fire stitched the Thunderbolt from nose to tail. Rounds punched through the engine cowling, shredded the right wing, tore holes through the tail assembly. One bullet struck the main spar in the left wing. Another severed a control cable. The aircraft rolled right. Johnson fought it, hauling the stick back and correcting with rudder. The P-47 leveled out. He glanced at the wing. There were 3-foot holes torn through the aluminum skin. He could see internal ribs and spars exposed to open air. Fuel streamed from a ruptured tank, not spraying, just trailing behind in a long ribbon. The self-sealing fuel bladders were working. Rubber layers inside the tanks were slowly swelling shut around the punctures. Not fast enough to stop the leak, but fast enough to prevent an explosion. The FW-190 pulled alongside, 50 feet away. Close enough for Johnson to see the German pilot's face. The man wasn't firing. He was looking, examining the Thunderbolt, taking in the damage. Johnson saw him shake his head. By every rule of aerial combat, the P-47 should have been falling out of the sky. It wasn't. The German dropped back again. Johnson saw him lining up for a third pass, directly behind, low 6 o'clock. The killing position. Johnson had nothing left. The aircraft couldn't maneuver. The controls barely responded. Hydraulics were gone. Visibility was almost non-existent. He was flying an airplane that should have already been a debris field over France. The channel was 10 miles ahead. White cliffs were visible through the oil-smeared canopy. England. Safety, if he could survive another 30 seconds. The German opened fire a third time. Another 6-second burst. The tail section absorbed most of it. Rudder. Elevators. Vertical stabilizer. Shredded. The Thunderbolt wallowed like a wounded animal. Johnson held the stick with both hands, muscles locked, fighting to keep the nose up. Then the firing stopped. Johnson waited for the fourth pass. It never came. Instead, the FW-190 pulled alongside again. This time even closer, 30 feet. Johnson could see every detail now through the grime. The German pilot looked from Johnson to the aircraft, counting holes, examining the torn wings and destroyed tail. His wingman was gone. His fuel was running low. He was alone over the channel, deep in enemy airspace. The German raised his hand. A slow, deliberate salute. Then he rocked his wings twice. Acknowledgement. Respect. The FW-190 banked hard right and dove away toward France. Johnson watched it disappear into the haze. Only then did he realize his hands were shaking, not from fear, but from exhaustion. He had been gripping the control stick for nearly 15 minutes without releasing it. His fingers cramped as he forced them to relax. The English coast was 5 miles ahead. The German fighter was gone. Johnson was alone over the channel, oil streaming across the canopy, the Thunderbolt descending steadily at 200 feet per minute. He checked the altimeter. 9,000 feet. Still losing altitude. The P-47 felt loose now, unstable, like it was held together by tension and luck rather than metal. Control inputs lagged. The rudder barely responded. Every correction required anticipation instead of reaction. He did the math automatically. At this descent rate, he would reach the channel at roughly 3,000 feet, maybe lower. That gave him very little margin if the engine failed. The fuel gauge read 1/4 tank, but the gauge had been unreliable since the first cannon hit. He assumed the worst. 20 minutes. Maybe less. Manston was still 35 miles inland. Too far. He needed land first. Any airfield. Any stretch of ground long enough to slide a 7-ton fighter onto its belly. The white cliffs grew clearer through the grime. Johnson crossed the English coastline at 7,000 feet. He had made it back to friendly territory, but the danger wasn't over. Not even close. He reached down and checked the landing gear indicator. Red. Hydraulics were dead. He tried the emergency hand pump anyway. The handle moved uselessly beneath his grip, resistance gone. The system was too badly damaged. There would be no wheels. He would have to belly land the Thunderbolt. No gear, no flaps, no brakes, and hope the fuel tanks didn't rupture violently on impact. Manston came into view ahead, a small forward airfield with a short concrete runway. Barely adequate for a normal landing. Marginal for a wheels-up crash in a damaged fighter. But there was no alternative. The engine began making new sounds. Grinding, uneven, metal knocking metal. The R-2800 had kept running through hell, but it was dying now. Johnson circled the field once, trading altitude for position. On the ground, air traffic control fired red flares. Emergency landing. Vehicles cleared the runway. Fire trucks and ambulances rolled into position. Mechanics stopped working and looked up. They had seen damaged aircraft return before. They had never seen one like this. Johnson lined up on final approach. 2,000 feet. Airspeed 140 miles per hour. Too fast. But without flaps, he couldn't slow further without stalling. 1,000 feet. The runway filled his windscreen. 500 feet. The engine coughed. Johnson held his breath. The engine caught again. 300 feet. He could see individual figures on the ground now. Fire crews, medics, officers, all staring up at the battered Thunderbolt. At 100 feet, Johnson pulled back on the stick. The nose rose. He cut the mixture. The engine died instantly. Silence, except for the wind screaming through bullet holes. The Thunderbolt hit the runway belly first at 120 miles per hour. Sparks erupted as aluminum scraped concrete. The sound was violent, like a train derailing. The aircraft skidded down the runway, trailing smoke and flame. Johnson fought to keep the wings level. The P-47 wanted to ground loop, to spin sideways and cartwheel. He countered with rudder and aileron, fighting inertia rather than aerodynamics. 200 yards. 300 yards. Speed bleeding away. At 50 feet from the end of the runway, the Thunderbolt shuddered and stopped. The propeller blades were bent backward. The belly was torn open. But the fuel tanks, somehow, had not exploded. Johnson was alive. He tried the canopy again. It wouldn't move. Smoke filled the cockpit. Not fire, but scorched metal and burned rubber. He could smell aviation fuel pooling beneath the aircraft. Fire crews arrived within seconds. One firefighter climbed onto the wing and jammed a crowbar into the canopy frame. Plexiglass cracked. The frame bent. The canopy moved 6 inches. Enough. 2 firefighters grabbed Johnson under the arms and pulled him free. They carried him away, 50 yards, then 100, before setting him down on the grass. A medic cut away his flight suit. Shrapnel wound in the right leg. Painful, not fatal. Burns on the face and hands. 1st degree, maybe 2nd. Oil was washed from his eyes. His vision cleared enough to focus. An ambulance arrived. Johnson refused the stretcher. He stood. His leg barely held him, but he walked to the ambulance anyway. Only after sitting down did the shaking begin. Johnson did not stay in the ambulance. After the medics cleaned the oil from his eyes and bandaged his leg, he pushed himself upright and limped back toward the runway. The doctor protested. Johnson ignored him. He needed to see the airplane. Halfpint sat where it had slid to a stop, scarred, torn open, smoke still curling from the belly. Mechanics, armorers, and pilots surrounded it in silence. No one touched it yet. They were still trying to understand what they were looking at. The chief mechanic walked slowly around the aircraft with a clipboard, stopping every few feet, making notes. When he saw Johnson approach, he didn't speak at first. He just handed him the clipboard. The tally was written in neat columns. 21 impacts from 20mm cannon shells. Over 200 machine gun holes counted, on one side only. The mechanic had stopped counting at 208. Johnson looked at the numbers, then at the aircraft. The right wing was perforated end to end. The left wing looked no better. The fuselage was torn open in places. The tail section resembled shredded fabric more than metal. Control surfaces were punctured so badly that daylight shone through them. The mechanic pointed to the armor plate behind the pilot's seat. At least 15 machine gun rounds had struck it directly. Any one of them, without that inch of steel, would have killed Johnson instantly. The engine cowling was destroyed. Several cylinders had been hit. Oil leaks marked half a dozen rupture points. Yet the Pratt & Whitney R-2800 had kept running for nearly half an hour after the first hit. The fuel tanks showed dozens of punctures, but the self-sealing bladders had done their job. They had leaked slowly instead of exploding. The tail assembly should have separated in flight. It had not. Control cables were severed in multiple places, yet enough redundancy remained for the aircraft to respond, barely. The mechanic wrote a final note at the bottom of the page. Category E, total loss. The airframe was beyond repair. Some components might be salvaged. The rest would go to scrap. Johnson rested a hand on the fuselage. Cold metal. Torn aluminum. Rough edges where cannon shells had ripped through. This machine had saved his life. The German pilot had saluted, but it was the Thunderbolt that deserved the respect. 5 pilots from the 56th Fighter Group did not return from that mission, for were shot down over France. One bailed out over the Channel and survived. The others were gone. Johnson spent 3 days at Manston recovering. Burns treated. Shrapnel removed. Doctors recommended 2 weeks of rest. He asked for 5 days. They compromised on 1 week. On July 10th, he climbed into a new P-47D. He named it Lucky. Not as a joke. Not as bravado. Lucky was simply the truth. Johnson flew 91 combat missions in 14 months. He destroyed 27 enemy aircraft, becoming the first American pilot in Europe to surpass Eddie Rickenbacker's World War I record. He did not chase kills. He flew escort, protected bombers, stayed with his wingmen, and used the Thunderbolt exactly as it was designed. High-speed dives, energy fighting, never turning with lighter fighters. The fear never vanished. It sharpened. Every mission began the same way. Checking the armor plate, the canopy, the fuel system. Trust nothing. Verify everything. Paranoid pilots lived. Careless pilots died. The war ended. Johnson went home. He rarely spoke about June 26th. Historians argued over the identity of the German ace who had saluted him. Some said Egon Mayer. Others disputed the records. The name remains uncertain. What is not uncertain is this. A German fighter emptied his guns into a P-47 at point-blank range. The American pilot should have died. The aircraft should have disintegrated. Neither did. Johnson later wrote that survival could not be explained by tactics alone or by luck alone. The Thunderbolt had been designed with one purpose, to bring its pilot home. On June 26, 1943, it fulfilled that purpose beyond every expectation. The P-47 Thunderbolt flew thousands of missions across every theater of World War II. It destroyed more ground targets than any American fighter. But pilots remembered it for one reason. When everything else failed, it kept flying. And sometimes that was enough.